Hello, my name is Keith Mackay. It is a real pleasure to be talking with you today. I will be talking about good practice government systems for monitoring and evaluation. The basis of my presentation is a book which the World Bank has just published called How to Build Monitoring and Evaluation Systems to Support Better Government. I think copies of this book will be available for you in your CD-ROM. Most governments which are members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and those of a growing number of developing countries, take monitoring and evaluation seriously and are devoting considerable resources to it. These governments can have several uses for monitoring information and evaluation findings, and these are listed on the first slide. The first of these uses is performance-based budgeting. In other words, to help governments prioritize among competing spending proposals in the annual budget process. A second use of monitoring information and evaluation findings is for planning, including sector planning and policy development. A third use is a better management of government programs, projects, and activities, and we call this the learning function of monitoring and evaluation. The last use is for accountability purposes, accountability within government and outside government, for example, to the National Assembly. Now, there appear to be a number of reasons why developing countries are now moving to build their own monitoring and evaluation systems. Please refer to the next slide. One reason is the demonstration effect of OECD countries, and a second reason is a demonstration effect of leading countries in the developing world, countries such as Chile and Colombia and Mexico, and also the demonstration effect of poorer countries that take monitoring and evaluation seriously, such as Uganda, Tanzania, and South Africa. A third reason is a high level of dissatisfaction in many countries that large increases in government social spending, such as on the training of teachers, that these increases have not been matched by increases in the quantity or the quality of services provided. A fourth reason is pressures for greater government accountability, pressures from within the government, from individual ministers or the heads of ministries, or pressures from national assemblies. A fifth reason is the donor pressures for governments to have poverty reduction strategies, as well as governments themselves which wish to monitor the extent of achievement of their national development plans. And a sixth reason why countries are devoting more attention to monitoring and evaluation is because of the examples of highly influential evaluations, such as the Progresa evaluation in Mexico or the Familia Senexian evaluation in Colombia. These evaluations were tremendously influential on the governments and persuaded the governments to retain the programs and actually to scale them up very significantly. These evaluations demonstrate the potentially very high returns to investment in evaluation. Now, among developing countries, Chile provides the strongest example of a very well-performing government system for monitoring and evaluation. That's the next slide, please. The system itself is run by the powerful finance ministry. Of course, in other governments, other countries, the lead ministry might be the planning ministry, such as in Colombia, or the prime minister's office, as it is in Uganda, or the president's office, which is the case in South Africa. Now, in Chile, the finance ministry collects over 1,500 performance indicators. And frankly, that's a very large number. Most governments find it very hard to cope with that many performance indicators. Most governments would have only a much smaller number of performance indicators. In Chile, they also conduct about 12 rapid evaluations each year and 4 rigorous impact evaluations each year, and between 1 and 2 comprehensive spending reviews. And these comprehensive spending reviews would cover an entire functional area of government, such as health spending or education spending, or an entire ministry. Now, the total cost of Chile's monitoring and evaluation system is $750,000 per annum. That may sound like a lot, but it's actually a very small proportion of total government expenditure, because the annual budget in Chile is about $20 billion per annum. Now, this detailed architecture of the Chilean government's system of monitoring and evaluation is not what makes their system impressive. What makes the system impressive is the very intensive use they are able to make of this information. And they make use of the information in 4 different ways. The first is by the Finance Ministry's budget analysts when they are preparing their policy advice for government in the annual budget process. The second way that the information is used intensively is by the budget director in his budget decisions. He has a ministerial rank. He's a very powerful person in the Chilean government. A third way the information is used by the Finance Ministry is to set performance targets for each ministry and agency. And because it's a very powerful ministry, the Finance Ministry, it is able to ensure that most of the sector ministries and agencies meet their targets. And the last way that this information is used intensively by the Finance Ministry is to impose program improvements and program changes on individual ministries and agencies. So please refer to the next slide. And this slide shows that almost 40% of the Chilean government's evaluations are used to make major changes in the management process of a program or activity. Almost a quarter lead to a substantial redesign of the program or a redesign of the ministry or agency of the organization. 9% of these evaluations lead to program termination. In other words, the program is ended, it is killed as a result of the evaluation. And it is this intensive utilization of the monitoring information and evaluation findings in Chile which makes the system so highly cost-effective for the government. And the government has recently taken the decision to expand the system quite considerably and to increase the amount it is spending on the system several-fold. Colombia, another government in another country in Latin America, also provides a strong example. The president of Colombia, President Uribe, uses performance information from the national evaluation system, and he has the database loaded on his personal computer. The database comprises 500 performance indicators, and he uses it in 2 main ways. Firstly is in his monthly meetings with each sector minister. These are his management control meetings. In his monthly meetings, he reviews the minister's performance with the government's targets, the government's goals for that ministry. And he looks in detail at each presidential goal, one after the other. And he expects the sector minister to be able to provide good reasons for any shortfall, any insufficient performance. And you can understand that that information is very powerful in these meetings, and it puts quite a strong accountability pressure on the individual ministers to perform well. The second way that President Uribe uses this information is in his weekly town hall meetings. Now, he has a town hall meeting each Saturday. It takes much of the day and is held in a different municipality around the country. And he talks about his government's progress in meeting the presidential goals, which he has committed his government to achieving. These goals are all publicly available. And he reports to local citizens about the extent to which the government has succeeded in meeting each goal or not meeting each goal. So he would say that in this municipality we have met the goal for education, but in health we have not met our goals. He would go through all the detailed goals one after the other. And then he might well have sitting next to him some of his ministers. And he would say, well, in our municipality we have not met my health goals. Fortunately, I have the health minister sitting right next to me, and she will explain why she has failed to meet my government's goals. this provides a very strong incentive for individual ministers to meet their goals. You can understand that having such information would change completely the nature of your discussions and the nature of your decisions. Let me give you a good example of a country which prepares poverty reduction strategy papers. It's Uganda in Africa. Now, several years ago, we conducted a diagnosis and we found that there are about 16 separate monitoring systems in Uganda. These systems are all uncoordinated. They produce excessive amounts of data, and the data are substantially unused. Also, the data are suspected to be poor quality, and this is a phenomenon in many poor countries. Large amounts of unused data of poor quality. In Uganda, we found that for just 3 sectors, for health, education, and for water sanitation, there are about 1,000 performance indicators. This represents an enormous amount of data that are collected on a regular basis, and a very difficult task it is to collect this data. So, for example, for each of the 110 districts in Uganda, each district has to make about 300,000 data entries per annum. This is an enormous burden. And of course, when the government learned of this burden, they were outraged. They realized that part of the problem was the many donor requirements for information. So donors are part of the problem, and a lack of donor harmonization is part of the problem. But the government of Uganda also realized that the government itself is partly to blame. For this reason, the government decided to create a new national integrated monitoring and evaluation system. And they created this system not to add to the complexity, not to add to the requirements, but as a vehicle to rationalize and to reduce substantially the existing data systems or subsystems which exist. The government overall wants to have less data, more information. And that's a good banner, a good slogan to have for any PRSP country. Now, Uganda provides a good example of what poorer countries can tackle, what they can cope with. For example, poorer countries can do reviews of their administrative data systems, these systems which produce performance indicators, and they can rationalize these systems. Poorer countries can also do public expenditure tracking surveys and service delivery surveys. Uganda, for example, was the first country in the world where a public expenditure tracking survey was piloted. These pilots were extremely successful, and the government was able to use the information that the pilots produced, information on the extent of leakage of government funds. The government was able to use this information to largely eliminate that leakage. Leakage, by the way, meant that the funds were being used for other unapproved purposes, or in many cases, the funds were being stolen. Corruption. The government now conducts these surveys on a regular basis, and it funds these surveys itself because it realizes how valuable this information is to them. So these surveys are a type of monitoring and evaluation tool. If you want to find out more about public expenditure tracking surveys, their costs, their advantages, how to do them, it's in this simple booklet on influential evaluations, which is also in your CD-ROM. Now, there are many lessons from experience in building government monitoring and evaluation systems, and these lessons are all in this book, which I mentioned earlier. I'll mention only 3 of these lessons now. There are more in the book. So please refer to the next slide. One of the lessons is the value of conducting a baseline diagnosis of a government's current systems for monitoring and evaluation and its current activities for monitoring and evaluation. A diagnosis would look at the strengths and the weaknesses on both the supply and demand sides. Supply in terms of the supply of monitoring information and the conduct of evaluations, and demand in terms of how information is currently used or not used. A diagnosis would look at the exact extent of utilization of this information for different purposes, such as use for national planning, use for ongoing management, use for sector work, or not. A diagnosis provides a vehicle for raising awareness in the government of what is monitoring and evaluation and what can it be used for. A diagnosis highlights current problems such as poor quality data or uncoordinated monitoring systems or poor quality evaluations or low utilization of this type of information, monitoring and evaluation information. Second lesson is that it's important to understand from the start the costs and benefits of your work to strengthen the government system for monitoring and evaluation. So to treat this issue, to treat the decision whether to strengthen a monitoring and evaluation system as an investment project, in this case an investment in the public sector. Now the costs of this investment would include the time and effort and resources needed to build a well-functioning system for monitoring and evaluation. The benefits are illustrated by those many OECD countries. In fact, just about every OECD country has invested a lot of effort in their monitoring and evaluation systems. They see this as a priority government area. Also, the benefits are illustrated by the growing number of developing countries with M&E systems. And these are discussed in the book that I mentioned before. Detailed case studies are in this book, looking at Chile and Colombia and Uganda, among other countries. It also helps in this work to understand the particular uses and limitations of each type of tool of monitoring and evaluation. Tools such as performance indicators, rapid evaluations, impact evaluations, and public expenditure tracking surveys. Now, also service delivery surveys. These tools, their advantages and limitations, are discussed in this booklet on monitoring and evaluation tools and methods. Again, that booklet is contained in your CD-ROM. And lastly, in this work, it's important to understand that you already have data systems and monitoring systems. As I said earlier, it's likely that there are a lot of overlapping, duplicated data of poor quality that are substantially underused. If you were to do a diagnosis, it would reveal the extent of these data problems. If this is the case, then a lot of what the government is currently spending on monitoring and data is being wasted. And the question would then become not, can you afford to strengthen your monitoring and evaluation system, but rather the question would become, can you afford not to strengthen it? Let me turn briefly to a third lesson, which is the dangers of a technocratic approach to building a monitoring and evaluation system. Conversely, the importance of also focusing on the demand side. A common mistake is to view a monitoring and evaluation system as simply the creation of a set of performance indicators or the operation of a data system or conducting rapid evaluations or public expenditure tracking surveys. It's to view these as being the most important thing. They are important, but they are in a sense important on the technical side. And these technical issues are important, but where most governments fail is in ensuring that the monitoring information and evaluation findings that these tools produce, ensuring that this information is actually used and used intensively. So the question for you is, with monitoring information and evaluation findings, how would you ensure that analysts who work for the Committee for Planning and Investment will actually use this information? Or managers in line ministries, sector ministries and agencies will actually use this information? Or the decision makers responsible for the national plan or the national budget will use this information? Now the answer to help ensure high levels of use of that information is to have strong incentives and to have a combination of carrots, sticks and sermons. Now in this book that I keep referring to, there is a long list of these incentives. There are over 40 which are presented to you. With carrots, for example, these are positive incentives. A staff incentive could be to require that planning analysts who are recruited or promoted, say planning analysts in the Committee for Planning and Investment, that they have some expertise with monitoring and evaluation. Another carrot would be to provide public recognition of program managers who are successful in achieving their performance targets under the national plan. A third carrot would be to provide greater funding or greater management autonomy to agencies that are successful in meeting their targets. Let me turn to negative incentives, sticks. These highlight bad results using monitoring and evaluation information. One stick is the embarrassment factor, for example, the Colombia example I mentioned earlier. Another stick is to withhold funding from agencies that fail to produce reliable data. Examples of sermons would include, for example, high-level statements of endorsement by senior officials and ministers, or by the President, or awareness-raising seminars such as this event that you are now attending. Let me turn to some commonly answered questions. There are many in the book. I will focus on two. People often ask me, they say, well, we have a problem in my country. We're a poor country. It's too big a step for my country to introduce a new monitoring and evaluation system all at once. How can we introduce a system progressively, step by step? And the answer is to look for quick wins. A good first step is to conduct a diagnosis. That will tell you who needs what information, for what purposes, and when do they need it. Another quick win is to conduct a review of existing data systems and to improve these data systems. Like I said before, you're likely to find excessive, underused data of poor quality. If that is the case, this will be a dramatic finding and will almost certainly prompt actions to fix these problems. Another quick win is to conduct pilot rapid evaluations and public expenditure tracking surveys. These can often be done cheaply and relatively quickly. We have examples in the materials which you are being given. It's also possible to conduct more expensive impact evaluations, and they can be funded by donors, but they're not particularly quick to do. They do provide good quality evaluation findings, very reliable, but they're not quick and they're not particularly cheap. But like I say, donors often are prepared to fund those types of impact evaluations. A second question is, how many performance indicators should my program or agency or ministry or government collect? Well, bear in mind, please, that most governments have too many performance indicators and of doubtful quality. It's a case of too much data, too little information. So please go to the slide which shows a lady sitting in a government planning office. If your monitoring and evaluation offices look like this, then you have a problem. This is an example of too much data that are collected by a government ministry, and the data simply collect dust. They sit in an office and are never used. Having too much data like this creates disincentives to data providers, people at the facility level who are providing their agency, and their agency providing the sector ministry, and the sector ministry providing the planning ministry with data. If these people at the facility levels who are providing the raw data have no incentive to provide good quality data, if they believe that their data are not being used, they have no incentive to provide good quality data. And that in turn will tend to lead to poor quality data being provided, which will further lower demand for the information. So it helps when you're considering how many performance indicators you should have, it helps to consider, again, who needs what performance indicators for their work, and how many performance indicators will they actually use, and what is the cost of these performance indicators. It helps to think of performance information as a pyramid, with having a small number at the top, such as the Millennium Development Goals or National Plan targets. At the middle, for mid-level officials, you would have many more indicators focusing on inputs, processes, and outputs. And at the bottom, you would perhaps have the greatest level of indicators for line managers and staff at operational levels and focusing on processes and services. Finally, the last slide is a set of resources that I've referred to. These are, I believe, available in your CD-ROM. I'd like to end there. Even though this presentation has been videotaped and I'm afraid I'm not able to be with you in person, I will be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. And the organizers of this event will forward your questions on to me, and I will be happy to answer them by email. Thank you very much.